so much for chatting with me about your new film, War Game. Jesse, it's great to see you again. And Tony, great to meet you for the first time here. Well, let's start at the beginning with the origins of the project. How did you guys get connected with Vet Voice, with this War Game? And how did you know that it was right for a film?
Well, we read this op-ed by these three generals in the Washington Post, calling out this threat that they see of extremism in the military and the risk that the next insurrection could be worse. And I think that caused a lot of people to sit up. You know, these were people from within the institution saying this is something we need to take seriously. And Vet Voice, not an organization that I knew, but a national nonpartisan veterans organization, led by Janessa Goldbeck, took up the challenge of organizing this war game. They weren't going to wait for the U.S. government to run it. They were going to run it themselves. And they're friendly with people in both parties and a lot of former service members who are nonpartisan. And we learned about them through some colleagues in the entertainment business and reached out and started a conversation about, well, I'll say when I heard that they were going to run this war game, I thought this is extraordinary. What a film this would be if we could get access. We won't get access. But it's something I'm thinking about. We're all thinking about what's our political future? What did we live through on January 6, 2021? Is it possible we could have a military-backed coup in this country? I think so. We know our democracy is not as impregnable and sturdy as we would like to believe. And what I loved, and the last thing I'll say, is that I didn't know what form this film would be because it's a war game. It's a work of improvisational theater, not unlike a film that Tony and I made about 15 years ago. Also a documentary, also a work of dystopian science fiction, all together, all wrapped up in some crazy package. And I just thought if we can raise the money and we can get the access, this will be an incredible film to think about what's next.
So it sounds like Jesse, you kind of heard about this first, and then Tony came on board. Is that right? Tony,
I, I
what were your
yeah.
first impressions?
Well, when Jesse called to describe to me what was on offer, my heart began to beat. I thought this is, it's the perfect way to deal with an issue that folks don't want to deal with, right? It's this notion of intentional blindness that the big thing that's right in front of you, people can't see it. So how do you do that? The Russians have this great expression, which is called the knight's move. It's, the movement that the knight on a chessboard takes, right? So your opponent thinks you're going one direction, but you go another direction, right? So by filming and having access to this role play exercise, which really was this grand theatrical initiative, right, as Jesse had mentioned, which is, fake by definition. We know the theater is fake. We know those are actors. In our case, they're not actors, but they're playing parts. We had the ability to hook the audience in a really fresh and interesting way, right? So, when folks watch a horror film, they know it's not real. They still get scared, but they know it's not real. So here's something in which, we lead the audience to understand that this is a construct, that President Hotham is not a real president. He's played by the former governor of Montana, Steve Bullock. And we see folks in hair and makeup. We see them learning their role, reading their roles, their AO, their area of operation, their duties. And then once the game begins, and the clock begins to tick down, and news of the world, of the sort of fictionalized world that we could control, begin to creep into the room, and you see the temperature rise. These folks become a president and his inner circle of advisors on January 6, 2025. There's no doubt. And the way this film works on an audience, it's proof positive that through this theatrical alchemy, in which something that's not real becomes more real than real.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, though this is a work of improvisational theater of a sort. They're not actors. They are former politicians, generals, what have you. Did you have any part in casting this, or was that done exclusively by Bet's Voice?
No, we didn't cast the role players. We certainly had uh, the power of emphasis, which role players we could choose to focus on. Of course, the president was going to be a central focus, but it was really a surrender of control that normally we would have in documentary, and is such a big part of all of our documentary. Who you choose to focus on, that's the power of the director. And so that was part of the terror of this project, but the thrill as well. And until we actually started filming the exercise itself, we didn't know if they could play their parts. We knew they had plenty of experience. That doesn't mean the camera, is going to kind of be compelled by them, or that their ability to sort of inhabit the role is going to make us lean forward and pay attention. And yet, when it started, we were hooked, transfixed. Like I felt like I was sitting in the White House Situation Room, pulling up a seat at the table, watching a president and his advisors wrestle with this most profound of questions: to deploy the active duty U.S. military on domestic soil, to stave off a potential civil war, right? So that was super interesting. And on the other hand, to sort of counterbalance that risk, we had a great deal of control over the environment that would be constructed in which they would play, and how we could build our team of filmmakers, collaborators around us, which was enormous by the standards of documentary. So I think it was that balance of control and chaos that I think is the place where really interesting work happens. And I'm sort of happy to live if I can find the money, or we can find the money to support this endeavor. That's where I like to make films.
Yeah, I want to hear about the nuts and bolts of capturing the actual war game. Of course, you did interviews pre and post with them, but primarily the majority of this movie is this 6-hour experiment here. So how did you prep to make sure you didn't miss any vital moments during that day?
That's a good question. And just to clarify, we did not have access to the role players before the exercise.
Oh, okay.
Because these folks are so busy and they're spread across the country. I mean, it's something we asked for. We thought, okay, wouldn't it be great if we could sit down with all the principals and get a sense of who's who and who's interesting, and just have that kind of advantage. We didn't have that. So we met these folks on January 6th when we filmed, right? So to answer your question, how did we prep? We did not design the game scenario, right? And the way a war game scenario is constructed by the game designers is that there are tentpole events, right? And these tentpole events in a screenplay, you'd call them inciting incidents. They're the sort of big events that happen, the crowd growing and the National Guard letting some of the protesters through. That's like the first event. And it's marked in our film and in the exercise by a news report. So we have television news. We created a TV news network. How did we prepare? So we knew that we needed to create these fake news pops. But again, we didn't write them. The scenario team wrote them and gave us the script. But we, knew that bringing some verisimilitude to this would make it a better movie. But we also knew that the verisimilitude of the set design, of the table, of the coasters on the table, would enhance the experience of these role players, because we really wanted them to slip into the dramatic scenario, right? And not be conscious of cameras and not be conscious of artifice, right? And that happened beautifully. It happened really beautifully. Designing the space, we had access to this hotel ballroom, which was, not cinematically interesting. The light in there was dreadful. So we needed to create cinematic space that also had practical function to it. It needed to be, you needed to bake in like a habit trail with gerbils, in a sense. How is the space going to encourage people to move? How is it going to encourage them to interact? What sort of tools will they have? Like, for example, the intercom that you see at a moment of crisis in the film. Those are all things that we, said, I think we need this. The fact that the red cell could be down the hall, but there would be a level of connectivity between the red cell and the blue cell, between the president in the Situation Room and the would-be insurrectionists. But they don't see everything. The red cell does not see everything that the blue cell is seeing. They see selectively, right? They can see the news reports. They see the same news reports that the blue cell reads. But everyone shares this sort of fake Twitter, this sort of social media universe, which is full of some legitimate sources, but a lot of propaganda. So how do you parse that? That was a big part of the game.
Mm. Yeah, that was amazing. You hinted at the way the movie looks as well, which is really striking. I mean, you guys shot this really like a thriller, from both the colors and the aesthetic of the set that you're in, but also camera movements. Tell me about developing the look and feel of this documentary.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the references immediately were works of narrative film, and we started with Dr. Strangelove. I mean, which in particular, the production design of the War Room set, probably the most famous built set in Hollywood history. But kind of a theatrical space, and that was like permission to not try to be totally faithful to the real White House Situation Room, which is a bit of a dingy basement room, if you've seen pictures of it, and so we could elevate our space. We looked at some theater that had inspired us, and the sort of the fluidity of onstage and offstage action unfolding simultaneously for the audience. That's exciting. We looked at the work of Edward Luttwak, a writer who wrote this famous book called Coup d'etat, a practical handbook, that kind of strange political science text. I mean, I think that's what was exciting to us, was to draw from all these places and to feel like we were doing something also a bit new. And so we did have control of that space. We had exceptional documentary cinematographers who also work in fiction, and fiction looks like fiction because of the control and the scale of production. And so we were able to build a lighting grid in the set that we could sort of dial in settings through the war game that corresponded to sort of the sequence of events, the tent pole injects that Tony mentioned, I think. So I think that we immediately recognized this was a real-time thriller, and that the audience should feel that way, and that we should strive to depict it visually in a way that drew people into the action, and the sort of the fluidity of the camera movement around the table, and as people kind of pass from one space to another. These were all intentional, but then we couldn't say action, cut, and you can't shoot, fiction looks like fiction because you can shoot coverage. But I think great documentary cinematographers understand the grammar of coverage, what that means to shoot a conversation, to shoot it like it looks like a movie. Like we're making a movie, and Tony and I wanted to make a film that could stand up on the big screen. I mean, we all say that, but I think we recognize that this film, as a work of theater and a work of cinema, could draw people together in a space to share this experience, and that could be cathartic and provocative at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about bringing people together to experience this. I'm not quite sure how to ask this next question, so forgive me, but I was watching the movie as a liberal person who's already frightened and horrified by the events of January 6th. But I was also having a hard time imagining, someone who thinks January 6th was overblown and, not really that bad.
Yeah.
I was struggling to see them watch the film. How do you craft the film? Of course, you would love everyone to see it, but how do you sort of, avoid preaching to the choir in a sense? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we don't want to do that. It's very important for us in our release plan to get this film into red and purple states, and we're doing that. And one way is through partnering with museums, through university museums, and partnering with universities. Which you could say are sort of liberal pockets in red states, but regardless, just getting into those spaces and having the conversation is critical to us. I also really do believe that as progressives, we bring a certain amount of baggage and assumptions about how this film will play. to people who don't hold our political points of view. And by way of example, you'll remember in the film, Janessa Goldbeck talks about her father, going down the QAnon rabbit hole and some of the crazy conspiracy theories that he was, that he had bought into. And so we've been asking Janessa since we made this film, has your father seen the film? Has your father seen the film? She'd say, I'm waiting for the right moment. I'm waiting for the right moment. Well, 2 weeks ago, she sat him down and watched the film with him. And there couldn't be a more ardent Trump supporter, and he loved the film and he thought it was reasoned, and he thought that Steve Bullock, as President John Hotham was fabulous. And not only in Bullock is sort of right out of central casting for a Kennedy-esque president, right? But that aside, he thought that the logic and the parsing of issues and concerns about security made a lot of sense. So to me, that said, you know what? Let's not make assumptions. And in a lot of ways, we're in this horribly divided state because of assumptions. We have to all approach the present with curiosity about one another, right? And with an agreement that there's certain elements of our democracy that we need to protect, regardless of your political persuasion. The peaceful transfer of power is foundational. Can we agree on that at least?
Absolutely.
And I think we could probably agree, red and blue, that the Insurrection Act is hazardous. So
Yeah. That's a really striking moment in the film, of course. Absolutely. Well, Jesse, you're no newcomer to this world of conflicting political ideologies in film. To me, as I was watching the film, there's some clear shared DNA between War Game and Girls and Boys State.
Yeah.
Obviously, very different in so many ways. But in terms of this kind of sort of political theater of sorts, what's your sort of view on the shared DNA between those films?
Well, I'd say two things. One is I'm interested in exploring the spaces that occupy what I'd call the fault line in American life, and spaces where people with different politics are trying to do something together. They're interesting to me, and I think that they're rare. So when I find them, I want to be in them, look at them, see what I can learn from them, and I'm interested in finding new ways to engage audiences and ways that are playful, that are not the same old media diet that, is either repellent or fatiguing or traumatizing. And humor, playfulness of form, what Tony calls sort of the blind spots too, that we all kind of live with, that if we look at them from the right perspective, they offer something new. That's what the story and its form and its content offered for me. It wasn't a revisit, an autopsy of J6 2021. Been there, done that, traumatizing. I love the idea that we could go into the White House sit room and pull up a chair and watch a president, played by a governor, be president. It's like, great. So that's what I'm looking for. I keep swearing off political films, and then I'm confronted by something like War Game, and I thought, there is no question I got to try to make this. So.
That's good. Well, Tony, you already started hinting at some of what's happened post-film, post-War Game, and post the film release. Tell me more. What has happened since? I know at the end of the film it says the findings will be delivered to government agencies. What conversations and movement have you guys seen happen?
Well, it's extraordinary. Since we premiered the film in January at Sundance, the world has changed, and it's changed at an unprecedented rate. So every time we see the film, and I've seen it probably on average 3 times a month, maybe, and with an audience, right? It feels like a different film altogether because of the context that's brought into the theater. So in some funny way, it's truly an interactive film, not in the sense that the frames of footage are shuffled or the ending changes depending on a whim of the audience. Not in that way, but in what the audience brings emotionally to the experience of watching it, into the tenor of the conversations that occur afterwards. But this film is truly a provocation for a conversation. We never screened it anywhere in which there was enough time for the Q&A. The Q&A always spills over into the lobby. Folks always, want to just hang out and keep talking. So it kind of is like a provocation for a conversation that people didn't know yet that they needed to have. And I'll just add that when we made this film, Trump wasn't the candidate, and it seemed that he had faded from political relevancy, and that DeSantis was the likely candidate. That's how much has changed since we shot this film, so it's extraordinary.
That's good. Well, speaking of not having enough time, I am getting the sign to wrap. One last question before I let you go. We are recording this on July 30th. And I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to, Jesse, you followed Pete Buttigieg famously in your film, Mayor Pete, and they are in the midst of Vice President Harris's Veep stakes, as it were, finding her right candidate for vice president. As someone who followed Pete on his run for president, what do you think about the potential of Vice President Pete Buttigieg?
I was just with my producer on that film and another filmmaker who's very politically well connected last night. I was asking them what they thought. I mean, I wish I had some insider knowledge. I mean, other than Pete's Instagram posts and Chasten's, I'm kind of out of the loop in that space. I guess if I've learned anything in the last few weeks, it's that I don't know what the next week is going to bring, and probably will be surprised. I mean, maybe it won't be anybody on that list. Pete's certainly making himself pretty visible, and I think he's really an impressive politician. And so I love the film. I mean, I love that he's still, in the world, and I feel like the film was honestly criminally underseen, and maybe people are ready to revisit Pete, whether or not he's the VP or pick or not.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, and can't wait for more people to see War Game.